You don't belong here." The words landed cold and sharp, echoing across the marble hallway as Officer Daniel Reeves tightened his grip on Ava Carter's wrist, guiding, no, dragging her through the courthouse doors as if she were already guilty of something no one had proven. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow over polished floors and muted faces, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in that quiet tension where no one speaks, but everyone watches, because they've seen this before. Or at least they think they have. Ava didn't resist, not physically, not verbally, her steps steady despite the pressure, her posture upright, her eyes forward, calm in a way that didn't match the situation, and that calm unsettled more than any protest ever could. Reeves exhaled through his nose, already irritated by her silence, already convinced he knew exactly who she was. The kind of woman who wandered into places she didn't belong, the kind who needed to be reminded of boundaries, of order, of authority, and in his mind, this wasn't personal, it was routine, just another disruption handled before lunch. The heavy courtroom doors swung open with a low creak, revealing rows of wooden benches slowly filling with spectators, lawyers adjusting their ties, clerks organizing stacks of paperwork, the quiet hum of a system preparing to do what it always did. And as Reeves led Ava down the center aisle, a ripple of whispers followed, subtle but unmistakable, eyes tracking every step, every movement, every assumption already forming before a single word had been spoken. "Right this way," Reeves muttered, though his tone carried no courtesy, only command, as he positioned her near the front, his hand lingering a second longer than necessary before letting go, as if releasing control was something he did reluctantly. Ava adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small, almost invisible motion, then stood still again, her breathing slow and measured, her gaze lifting briefly to scan the room, not in fear, not in confusion, but in quiet recognition, like someone who had seen this exact moment before, maybe not here, maybe not today, but enough times to understand exactly how it would unfold. A clerk behind the bench glanced up, her fingers pausing mid-paper shuffle, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as they landed on Ava. Something unreadable flickering across her expression before she quickly looked back down, pretending nothing had happened, pretending everything was normal. Reeves, however, noticed none of it. Or if he did, he dismissed it, because in his world, things were simple, clear lines between who held authority and who followed it. And standing there in his uniform, badge catching the overhead light, he felt firmly on the right side of that line. "We've got a disturbance," he announced to no one in particular, loud enough for the room to hear, loud enough to establish control, his voice cutting through the low murmur like a blade, and a few heads turned, a few eyebrows lifted, but no one questioned him, no one stepped in, because the system rarely interrupted itself. Ava remained silent, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her face composed, almost serene, and if you were close enough, if you looked carefully, you might have noticed the faintest shift in her eyes, not fear, not anger, but something deeper, something patient, as if she were waiting for a moment no one else could see yet. And somewhere in that room, beneath the routine, beneath the assumptions, beneath the quiet weight of judgment, something had already begun to change, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, like a clock ticking toward a truth that would not stay hidden much longer. The courtroom settled into a tense rhythm, the kind that felt routine to everyone except the one standing at its center, and as the low murmur of voices faded into a controlled silence, Officer Daniel Reeves shifted his weight slightly, folding his arms across his chest with quiet confidence, scanning the room as though he already knew how this would end. To him, this was just another interruption to be processed, another face in a long line of people who had walked in without understanding how things worked here. And yet something about Ava Carter's stillness lingered at the edge of his awareness, something he chose to ignore because uncertainty had no place in authority. A bailiff stepped forward, adjusting his jacket, his voice steady but not entirely at ease as he called for order, the sound echoing gently against the high ceilings, and one by one, conversations died down, papers stopped shuffling, and all attention shifted toward the front where the judge's bench stood elevated. Empty for now, waiting, Ava remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if time moved differently for her, as if the tension in the room did not belong to her, but to everyone else. And when a man seated 2 rows back leaned toward his companion and whispered something under his breath, she did not react, though she heard it, though she heard all of it, the assumptions, the quiet judgments, the certainty people carried without ever questioning where it came from. Reeves let out a short breath, glancing briefly toward the clerk's desk, where files were being arranged with careful precision, and for a fleeting second, he noticed the clerk hesitate again, her eyes flicking toward Ava before quickly returning to her work, and it was subtle, almost nothing, but it planted the faintest seed of irritation in him, because hesitation meant doubt, and doubt had a way of spreading if not controlled. "Let us keep this moving," he said under his breath, not loud enough to draw attention, but firm enough to reaffirm his presence. And as he straightened his uniform, he felt the familiar sense of control settle back into place, the quiet assurance that whatever this situation was, it would resolve the way it always did, clean, efficient, unquestioned. Ava shifted her gaze slightly, not toward him, but toward the bench, her eyes tracing the lines of the wood, the height of the chair, the space where decisions were made and voices were either heard or dismissed, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible crossed her face. Not emotion exactly, but recognition. Like someone standing in a place they understood far more deeply than anyone around them realized. The bailiff cleared his throat, preparing to begin, his hand hovering near a stack of documents as if waiting for confirmation that everything was in order. But there was a pause, a small, lingering pause that stretched just long enough to be noticed, just long enough for the air to feel heavier. And in that space, Reeves felt it again. That subtle misalignment between what he expected and what was unfolding, though he could not name it, could not place it, and so he dismissed it once more, because in his world, things were simple, predictable, controlled. "Call the case," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to push the moment forward, and the clerk nodded, her hands steady now as she reached for the file, her eyes scanning the page before lifting, her voice clear as she prepared to speak, and as the name formed on her lips, the room seemed to lean in, not consciously, not deliberately, but instinctively, as if something unseen had just shifted beneath the surface, something waiting to rise, something that would not stay hidden much longer. "Ava Carter," the clerk finally said, her voice clear but carrying an undertone that only a few in the room seemed to catch, and for a split second, nothing happened, as if the name itself had not yet landed, as if it needed time to settle into the space before anyone could react. Officer Daniel Reeves tilted his head slightly, his brow tightening with mild impatience, expecting movement, expecting confusion, expecting the usual hesitation that followed when someone realized they were being formally called forward. But Ava did not move, not immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to pull the room into a deeper silence. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, her shoes making a soft, measured sound against the polished floor, each step deliberate, controlled, as if she were not approaching judgment, but walking towards something she already understood, and a few heads turned more fully now, whispers fading as attention sharpened, because there was something in the way she moved that did not align with the situation Reeves believed he had under control. He watched her closely now, a flicker of confusion threading through his confidence, because people in her position did not walk like that, did not carry themselves with that kind of quiet certainty, and yet he said nothing, because authority, once spoken, could not afford to question itself in public. Ava reached the front, pausing briefly near the railing, her gaze lifting toward the bench again, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to follow that gaze, drawn upward to the empty chair that had not yet been occupied, the symbol of judgment that loomed over every case, every voice, every decision made within those walls. The bailiff shifted, clearing his throat again, his posture tightening as if he, too, felt the subtle shift in the air, though he could not explain it, and the clerk glanced down at the file once more, then back up at Ava, her expression now more focused, more certain, as if whatever hesitation had been there before had resolved into something else entirely. Reeves stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep it between them, His tone edged with restrained authority as he said, "You heard your name. Step forward and face the court." But Ava did not respond to him, not directly, and that absence of acknowledgement landed heavier than any argument could have, because it suggested something Reeves was not prepared to consider, something outside the structure he relied on. Instead, Ava continued forward, passing the railing, moving toward the side steps that led upward, and that was the moment the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, like a current changing direction beneath still water. A man seated near the front leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as recognition sparked, while another adjusted his glasses, watching more intently now, and even the clerk straightened slightly, her hands resting still on the desk, as if she were waiting for something she already knew was coming. Reeves felt it then, that unmistakable sensation that something was no longer aligned with his expectations, that the script he thought he was following had changed without his consent, and for the first time since he walked into the building, he hesitated, just a fraction, just enough to register the unfamiliar. Ava placed her hand lightly on the railing of the steps, her movement unhurried, and as she began to ascend, the sound of her footsteps seemed louder now, not because they were, but because the room had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on her, every assumption recalibrating in real time, and Reeves turned slightly, his gaze following her upward, his mind racing to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed, but the two no longer matched. At the top of the steps, Ava paused, turning just enough to face the room, her expression composed, her presence undeniable, and then, without a word, she moved behind the bench, her hand resting briefly on the back of the chair before she took her seat, and in that single, quiet motion, the entire balance of the room shifted, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful, the undeniable weight of truth revealing itself exactly where no one expected it to be. Silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the courtroom like something tangible as Ava Carter settled into the judge's seat with a calm that did not ask for permission and did not seek approval. And in that moment, the room did not erupt. It froze, because the shift was too precise, too undeniable to ignore. Officer Daniel Reeves stood exactly where he had been, but nothing about his position felt the same anymore. His posture still upright, yet subtly rigid, as if his body had not yet caught up to what his eyes were trying to process. And for the first time, the authority he carried did not expand in the room. It shrank. The clerk was the first to move, her voice steady but now carrying a different weight, one of formality aligned with recognition rather than uncertainty as she said, "All rise." And the command rippled through the courtroom instantly, benches creaking as people stood, not out of confusion, not out of hesitation, but out of instinct, because the structure they trusted had just revealed itself in a way they could not deny. Reeves did not move right away, not because he chose not to, but because for a fraction of a second, he was caught between two realities, the one he believed he controlled and the one now unfolding in front of him. And when he finally straightened fully, the motion felt delayed, slightly out of sync with everyone else, a detail so small yet so loud in a room built on precision. Ava's gaze moved across the courtroom slowly, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, her presence filling the space without raising her voice, without making a single unnecessary gesture. And when she spoke, her tone was even, measured, and unmistakably authoritative as she said, "Be seated." The words landing with quiet finality as the room responded instantly, the sound of movement returning in a controlled wave before settling once again into silence. Reeves swallowed, a subtle motion that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, now, it felt exposed, because every assumption he had made just minutes ago was now standing in direct contrast to reality, and the gap between those two things was closing fast. Ava reached for the file in front of her, her fingers moving with familiarity, not hesitation, as she opened it and glanced down, her eyes scanning the contents with a focus that suggested she already knew exactly what she would find, and that detail, that quiet certainty, pressed further against Reeves's thoughts, because this was no longer a situation he could categorize, no longer something he could simplify into routine. "Officer Reeves," Ava said, lifting her gaze just enough to meet his. And there was no anger there, no visible judgment, only clarity, the kind that left no room for misinterpretation. You brought this matter before the court, and the statement was simple, factual, yet it carried a weight that shifted the responsibility back onto him in a way he had not anticipated. Reeves cleared his throat. Lightly, stepping forward half a pace, his voice controlled but no longer effortless as he replied. Yes, Your Honor. There was a disturbance. And even as he spoke, the title felt different coming from him now. Heavier, more binding, as if acknowledging it forced him to confront the reality he had tried to define moments earlier. Ava nodded once, a small, precise motion, then looked back down at the file, turning a page with deliberate care, and the room waited, every second stretching as. Attention narrowed onto the exchange, because something else was building now, not loud, not dramatic, but inevitable, like a truth that had been waiting for the exact right moment to surface. The clerk remained still, hands folded neatly, the bailiff standing straighter than before, and even the spectators seemed to hold their breath, sensing that what was unfolding was no longer about a single moment, but about something larger, something that reached beyond the walls of that courtroom. Ava paused, her eyes resting on a particular line, then lifted her gaze again, this time not just at Reeves, but at the entire room, and in that pause, in that controlled stillness, it became clear that the situation had fully reversed, not through force, not through noise, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of authority that had been there all along, simply waiting to be seen. Ava did not rush the moment. She let it breathe, let the weight of the silence settle fully before she spoke again. Because in a room like this, timing was not just important, it was everything. And as her fingers rested lightly on the open file, she turned another page with calm precision, her eyes scanning line after line as though each word confirmed something she already understood. Let us be clear, she said, her voice steady, measured, carrying across the room without effort, and every head remained still, every movement paused, because no one wanted to miss what came next. This is not simply a matter of a disturbance. And the phrasing alone shifted the atmosphere, drawing a clear boundary between assumption and fact. Officer Daniel Reeves stood straighter, instinctively reinforcing his posture. But there was a difference now, a subtle tension in his shoulders, a carefulness in the way he held himself, because the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had been when he first walked in. Ava continued, her gaze lowering briefly to the file before lifting again. According to this report, the individual in question was cooperative, compliant, and made no attempt to disrupt proceedings. And the words landed softly, but their implication carried weight, because they did not accuse, they simply presented, and in that presentation, they exposed the gap between what was said and what was recorded. A faint shift moved through the spectators, not loud enough to break decorum, but enough to register, a quiet recalibration of perception as people began to look at Reeves differently, not as the unquestioned authority he had been minutes ago, but as someone now being evaluated under that same authority. Reeves cleared his throat again, his voice measured as he responded. Your Honor, with respect, the situation required immediate action based on my judgment at the time. And he chose his words carefully now, each one placed with intention, because this was no longer routine. This was scrutiny. Ava nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without interrupting, her expression unchanged, and that composure, that lack of visible reaction, pressed further into the tension, because it offered no resistance, no emotional foothold, only structure and clarity. Judgment, she repeated softly, as if considering the word itself, then glanced back down at the file, her finger resting briefly on a specific section before she continued, is not independent of accountability. And the sentence settled into the room with quiet authority, not raised, not emphasized, yet impossible to ignore. The clerk remained still, her attention fixed forward, while the bailiff's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, more aligned now with the bench than the floor, reflecting the subtle but complete realignment of power within the room. Ava turned another page, revealing documents beneath. And though she did not describe them in detail, the act alone suggested depth, history, context beyond the immediate moment, and Reeves felt it, that expanding scope, that widening frame in which his actions were no longer isolated but connected. This court does not operate on assumption. Ava continued, lifting her gaze once more. It operates on record, on evidence, and on the responsibility of those who carry authority to exercise it with precision. And as she spoke, her eyes met Reeves's again, not with hostility, not with judgment, but with a clarity that left no space for deflection. Reeves nodded once, a controlled motion. But the confidence behind it had shifted, no longer absolute, now measured, aware, and for the first time, he understood that this was not about correcting a moment. It was about examining a pattern. The room held steady, every person present now fully aware that what was unfolding extended beyond a single interaction, that it was revealing something deeper about how authority was used, how it was perceived, and how quickly it could be redefined when placed under the right light. Ava paused. Again, allowing the silence to return, not as emptiness, but as emphasis, as space for the weight of her words to settle. And in that pause, the truth of the situation became clearer, not through confrontation, not through force, but through the steady, deliberate unveiling of what had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. Ava let the silence linger just long enough to make every person in the courtroom feel the weight of it. Then she closed the file halfway, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a controlled motion that signaled a shift from reading to revealing. And when she looked up again, her gaze was no longer just observational. It was intentional. "Officer Reeves," she said, her voice even, steady, carrying across the room with quiet authority, "how long have you served in this department?" And the question seemed simple, almost routine, but in the context of everything that had already unfolded, it carried a deeper purpose, one that reached beyond the surface. Reeves straightened slightly, his voice measured as he responded. 14 years, Your Honor." And there was a trace of pride in the number, a reminder of experience, of time spent operating within the system he trusted. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the answer, her expression unchanged. 14 years, she repeated softly, as if placing the number into a larger framework. Then she turned the file slightly, revealing another section, her finger resting on a line that she did not immediately read aloud, allowing the anticipation to build in the quiet space that followed. "And in those 14 years," she continued, her tone still calm, still controlled, "how many times have you filed reports based solely on your immediate judgment?" And this time, the question shifted, not accusatory, not confrontational, but precise, narrowing the focus in a way that made the room lean in just a little closer. Reeves hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, a pause so small it might have gone unnoticed earlier. But now it stood out, because everything about this moment was being observed more carefully. "I follow procedure, Your Honor," he replied, choosing his words with care, "and I act when necessary to maintain order." And the answer sounded correct, structured, aligned with expectation, yet it did not fully address the question. Ava allowed a brief pause to settle between them, then nodded again. "Procedure," she echoed, before gently turning the page, revealing more documentation beneath. And though she still did not read every detail aloud, the implication was clear. There was more here than a single incident, more than a single decision. "This file," she said, her voice steady, "contains multiple instances where your immediate judgment resulted in actions that were later reviewed." And the phrasing remained neutral, factual, but the effect was undeniable, because it introduced pattern, continuity, something that extended beyond the present moment. A subtle shift moved through the room again, not loud, not disruptive, but present, as if the air itself had changed density, and Reeves felt it, the narrowing of space around him, the transition from control to examination, and for the first time, his stance adjusted not to assert authority, but to hold it together. "Those reviews," he began, his voice still controlled but now more deliberate, "did not result in any formal disciplinary action." And there it was, the defense built on outcome rather than process, on what had not happened rather than what had. Ava listened without interruption, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, and when he finished, she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement before responding. "Absence of consequence," she said quietly, "is not the same as absence of impact." and the words settled into the room with a clarity that required no emphasis. The clerk remained still, her attention fixed forward. The bailiff's stance firm, aligned with the bench, and even the spectators seemed to hold their breath again, sensing that the moment had shifted once more, deeper now, more focused. Ava reopened the file fully, her eyes scanning one final section before she spoke again. Today is not about a single decision, she continued, her voice unwavering. It is about understanding how decisions are made when authority is assumed rather than examined. And as she said it, her gaze lifted to meet Reeves's. Once more, steady, unflinching, not hostile, not emotional, but precise. Reeves nodded slowly, the motion controlled, but the confidence behind it had changed, now tempered by awareness, by the realization that this was no longer a situation he could define on his own terms. Ava allowed another brief pause, letting the weight of her words settle fully before continuing, and in that pause, the room seemed to recalibrate once again, every person present now aware that what was unfolding was not just a correction, not just a review, but a moment of clarity, one that would not easily be dismissed or forgotten, because it was not being forced into the light, it was revealing itself, step by step, exactly where it had always been. Ava did not immediately continue. She let the last sentence remain in the air, allowing its meaning to settle into every corner of the room. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, within the people watching, within the structure they trusted, within the man standing at the center of it all. Officer Daniel Reeves felt it most clearly, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual tightening, a quiet pressure that made every word he had spoken moments earlier feel heavier, less certain, and as he stood there, his hands now resting at his sides instead of folded across his chest, he understood that this was no longer about defending a decision. It was about confronting the foundation beneath it. Ava closed the file gently this time, the soft sound marking a transition, not an ending, and when she looked up, her gaze was steady, unwavering, not searching for answers, but presenting them. There is a difference, she said, her voice calm but carrying a clarity that reached every ear in the room, between enforcing order and assuming disorder, and the distinction, though simple in wording, expanded. In meaning, drawing a line that had not been clearly seen before. Reeves inhaled slowly, the movement subtle but deliberate, as if grounding himself in the moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, not entirely, but enough to be noticed. Your Honor, I made a judgment call based on the situation as I perceived it. And this time, there was less certainty in the statement, more acknowledgement, more awareness of the space he now occupied. Ava nodded slightly, accepting the statement. Without resistance, perception, she repeated, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than before, is shaped by experience, by environment, by expectation. And as she spoke, the words seemed to widen the scope of the conversation beyond the individual, beyond the moment, into something more complex, more layered. The spectators remained silent, but their attention had shifted, no longer passive, now engaged, as if they were not just watching a proceeding, but witnessing a recalibration of something they had taken for granted. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, still controlled, but now carrying a different kind of weight, one that came from understanding rather than authority alone. The responsibility of this court, she continued, is not to challenge authority for the sake of it, but to ensure that authority is applied with awareness. And the sentence settled into the room with quiet finality, not as a reprimand, not as a declaration, but as a standard. Reeves lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, and in that small shift, the dynamic changed once more, because for the first time, he was not speaking from position, he was listening from within it. Ava reached for the file again, not to reopen it fully, but to rest her hand upon it, as if acknowledging everything it contained without needing to revisit each detail. And when she spoke again, her tone remained steady, but there was a subtle shift, a movement toward resolution. This court recognizes that decisions made in the moment are not always made with full information, she said. But it also recognizes that those decisions carry weight beyond the moment itself. And as she said it, Her gaze moved briefly across the room, encompassing not just Reeves, but everyone present, as if reminding them that this was not isolated, that it extended outward. Reeves nodded slowly, the motion more natural now, less controlled, and in that nod, there was something new, something that had not been there before, not agreement, not surrender, but understanding, the beginning of it at least. Ava allowed a brief silence to follow, not empty, but full, filled with the quiet recognition of what had just unfolded, and then she spoke once more, her voice soft but clear. The purpose of this moment is not to assign fault, but to illuminate responsibility. And in that sentence, the entire room seemed to settle, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had been transformed into something else, something more precise, more grounded. The clerk remained still, the bailiff steady, the spectators attentive, and Reeves stood at the center of it all, no longer the unquestioned authority he had been when he walked in, but not diminished either, instead repositioned, realigned within a system that had just reminded him, and everyone else, that authority does not define truth, it answers to it. Ava let the final words settle without interruption, allowing the silence to complete the thought rather than rushing to fill it. And in that stillness, the courtroom felt different now, not tense in the same way it had been before, but focused, as if every person present had been pulled into a clearer understanding of what had just unfolded. She shifted slightly in her seat, her posture still composed, still grounded, but now carrying the quiet authority of conclusion, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the room was already listening. This court acknowledges, she said, her tone even and deliberate, that authority is often exercised in moments where time is limited and information is incomplete. And the statement did not challenge, it recognized, it created space rather than closing it, and that distinction mattered. Officer Daniel Reeves remained standing, his stance no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but attentive, as if he understood that what came next would define not just this moment, but how it would be remembered. Ava continued, her gaze steady. However, when authority is applied without reflection, even briefly, it carries consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. And as she spoke, her eyes moved slightly across the room, acknowledging not just Reeves, but the system around him, the structure that allowed moments like this to exist without question, until they were examined. The clerk remained still, her hands folded neatly, her attention unwavering, while the bailiff stood firm, aligned with the bench, reflecting the quiet recalibration that had taken place. Ava rested her hand lightly on the file once more, not opening it, not needing to, because everything that needed to be said was no longer confined to the pages. It had been brought into the room itself. In this case, she said, her voice maintaining that same steady cadence, the record reflects a decision made without sufficient basis to justify the level of intervention that followed. And though her wording remained careful, measured, the meaning was clear, and it settled into the space with quiet certainty. Reeves inhaled slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers. And there was no resistance there now, no attempt to redirect, only acknowledgement. Because the clarity of the moment left little room for anything else, Ava paused briefly, allowing that acknowledgement to exist without pressure, then continued. The purpose of this proceeding is not to diminish the role of law enforcement, but to reinforce the responsibility that comes with it. And the distinction mattered, because it framed the outcome not as punishment, but as alignment, as correction within the system rather than against it. A subtle shift moved through the spectators, not loud, not disruptive, but present, as if the understanding had reached beyond the front of the room and settled into those watching, those listening, those who would carry the story beyond these walls. Ava's gaze returned to Reeves, steady, clear, and when she spoke again, her tone carried a quiet finality. Therefore, this court finds that the actions taken in this instance did not meet the standard required of this position, and the sentence, though measured, marked the turning point fully, the moment where clarity became conclusion. Reeves nodded once, a controlled, deliberate motion, and in that nod, there was acceptance, not of defeat, but of reality, of the standard that had been placed before him and the recognition that he had not fully met it. Ava allowed one final pause, not for effect, but for completion, letting the weight of the decision settle naturally before she spoke again. This matter will be formally reviewed and documented in accordance with departmental oversight procedures. And the words were procedural, structured, yet they carried significance because they ensured that the moment would not disappear, would not be dismissed as isolated. The room remained still, the air no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a different kind of gravity, one that came from understanding rather than uncertainty. And as Ava looked across the courtroom once more, her presence steady, her voice calm, it was clear that what had taken place was not simply a reversal of roles, but a restoration of balance. A reminder that authority, when examined, does not weaken, it becomes accountable, and in that accountability, it finds its true purpose. The courtroom did not move right away, as if everyone present understood that something more than a decision had just taken place, something that did not end with a gavel or a final word, but lingered in the air, settling into memory, into perspective, into the quiet space where reflection begins. Ava Carter remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting calmly on the bench, her gaze steady as she looked across the room one last time, not searching for reactions, not measuring responses, but acknowledging the weight of what had unfolded. And then, with the same composure she had carried from the beginning, she gave a slight nod, signaling closure without needing to announce it. The clerk moved first, her voice clear, "All rise." And once again, the room followed, not out of habit this time, but with a deeper awareness, a recognition of the role each person played within the system they had just seen more clearly. Officer Daniel Reeves stood still for a brief second before rising fully, his posture no longer defined by certainty, but by understanding. And as he looked toward the bench, there was no resistance in his expression, no lingering defiance, only a quiet acknowledgement of the standard that had been placed before him and the reality that he would carry it forward. Ava stood, stepping away from the bench with the same measured pace, her presence no less authoritative as she descended from the elevated position, the physical distance between her and the floor closing, but the clarity she had established remaining firmly in place. As she passed by the railing, the same path she had walked earlier under entirely different assumptions, the room watched in silence, not because they expected something more to happen, but because they understood that what had already happened was enough. Reeves shifted slightly, his hands resting at his sides, and for a moment, their paths aligned within the same space, not as opposing forces, not as roles in conflict, but as two individuals positioned within a system that had just revealed its expectations more clearly than before. Ava paused briefly, her gaze meeting his, and there was no triumph there, no sense of victory, only a calm, steady presence, the kind that does not need to assert itself because it has already been understood. And in that moment, the silence between them carried more meaning than any words could have added. Reeves nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, not prompted, not required, but offered, and it marked the final shift, the point where recognition replaced assumption, where understanding replaced certainty. Ava continued forward without another word, moving toward the exit as the room slowly began to return to motion, the quiet hum of voices rising again, but different now, more measured, more aware, as if each person carried a piece of what they had just witnessed. The clerk resumed her work. The bailiff adjusted his stance. The spectators exchanged glances that held more thought than before, and Reeves remained where he was for a moment longer, not frozen, not uncertain, but reflective, standing in the space where authority had been examined and redefined. And as the doors of the courtroom opened and closed once more, the scene did not end with noise or spectacle. It ended with something quieter, something lasting. A reminder that the law is not defined by who speaks the loudest or stands the tallest, but by who understands its weight, because in the end, he thought he was bringing someone into judgment, but what he truly brought into that room was himself.